from a place where mothers go to battle each day with the baby strapped across their backs. Another still clinging from their breasts. It is child care at its finest. A place of street businessmen who don't need a white collar to make deals. They sign contracts with handshakes. Shirtless, sometimes shoeless, they will show you how to make money. And you will find anything in these streets, from hubcaps to toilet seats, it's been said. If you leave home naked, find yourself caught in the gridlock traffic of Lagos roads, they will have you dressed. Boardroom sharp, briefcase in hand between the mainland and the island. And I come from a place of jaw-dropping mansions and face me, I face you rooms, where a child hawks goods in the blazing sun next to an air-conditioned Mercedes-Benz. There are dichotomies here, with abject poverty chewing at the seams that bind us, but we are the same people who built a city on water, who bend fire and metal to give you art, built empires before the world's first breath. Check your textbooks. Better yet, check your encyclopedias, read between the lines, you will find us there, you will find us everywhere. Every continent, every climate, every country speaking Portuguese, French, Italian, and they call us uncivilized. We can show you how to perfectly pair your caviar and wine and still get down fingers deep in a plate of pounded jam. And I come from a place where the world's best storytellers first spoke, who taught you that you must set forth at dawn. Be no longer at ease with that thing around your neck before things fall apart. So when you ask me where I come from, there are things that I want to tell you that are louder than my bright green passport. Things that are heavier than the filled explosive cradled in Mutalab's underpants. Things that are more colorful than a well-crafted 419 email. You will never understand who I am until you know exactly where it is that I come from. So I wrote that poem to reaffirm who I was. I wrote it at a time when I was frustrated and tired and even a little angry about every time someone said, "Where are you from?" And I'd say Nigerian. And I could see the wheels just turning in their heads because I knew there was a backstory that was happening there that I felt had nothing to do with me. Chinua Achebe says, if you don't like someone's story, then write your own. And that's exactly what I wanted to do. And poetry became a way for me to push back against all of these reflections I felt were not like me. But I'll go back to the beginning. The first time that I knew that I was Black, like really understood what it meant, I was 13 years old. My family had just immigrated to Canada, and I found myself confronted with this staggering otherness. Many people call this culture shock, this kind of disorientation you feel when you're introduced into a new environment, when you change social environment. But I knew that it was more than just a change in environment or a change in culture, but that somehow I had been fundamentally reduced. And the norm had shifted, and somehow I was on the outside of this norm. And it seemed everybody around me was determined to remind me of that fact. And so in the first few months, I learned words like minority, like immigrant, like Black, this brand new vocabulary for who I was. I was a teenager in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. And my point of reference for who I was 6,000 miles away. I had to learn to adapt by grasping at what was closest to me and to build this new self, essentially, from scratch. And I remember walking into my junior high classroom on my first day in Canada, and feeling like the air had been sucked out of the room. I had never felt so put on the spot, so completely out of place. I was immediately introduced as a new girl from Africa, and the first few weeks I was bombarded with questions about where I was from. Did I live in a hut? Did I see animals walking in the streets? And what about the war? And what about poverty? Everything was questioned right down to the braids on my head. And on the one hand, I could understand that the children, or even the adults around me, also felt a kind of culture shock by my presence and were trying to sort of orientate themselves in the world. But I had inadvertently become the poster child of the Africa of their imaginations. This one that was reinforced by the television, by the news, and what they had heard about chaos and bloodshed. And with every question, it became clear that people like me, for many people, had occupied this space in their minds, which had colored the way in which they saw me even before I opened my mouth. And so every time I said, no, I didn't live in a hut. No, we don't walk barefoot with animals on the streets. No, I'm not a refugee. No, my country is not at war. I felt like I was shaking the foundations of these perceptions, and perhaps in some tiny way, I was slowly starting to learn how words, the stories we tell, the narratives that we reinforce have power. And a large part of that era in a young person's life is this desire to fit in. I wanted desperately to be cool, to be just like everyone else, and in the way that I dressed, in the way that I talked, in the things that I liked. That is what a young child wants. And I was lucky to make some quick friends, and over time I started to relax into my new environment. But even within these friendships, there were these very clearly defined boundaries. I was the black girl. I knew how to braid hair really well. I was a great dancer and a natural athlete, but I knew that none of this was really true. I could braid hair, yes. I thought I was a good dancer. Whether or not that was true was up for debate, but I definitely was not the kind of person you would call an athlete. And ultimately, these understandings of my blackness were very one-dimensional, very narrow, borrowed largely from African-American pop culture, and then dashed in with these very safe African narratives of safaris and jungles, something wild and tame, something just a little bit outside of normal. I felt boxed in. By drawing in these parts of their expectations, I allowed myself to fit in for a time, because it was safer to fit in that way without having to do the real work of getting to know myself. But each day was like a balance of two selves. So the one self that I was at school, and the other self that I was at home. At home, where we still ate powdered yam and eforiro, plantain and jollof rice, where I spoke Yoruba without an accent, and where even laughter had a different sound. I felt this kind of safety in this nostalgic universe that my family and our friends had created around ourselves. But I found myself simultaneously embarrassed of being so unapologetically African. I too had begun to believe this narrative about myself, so I stuffed the other self down when I was back at school or outside, and I had no language for what I was experiencing at the time. But I know now that what that was shame. And eventually all these emotions bubbled over, and the only place to put them was on the page. So I started writing poetry somewhere between junior high and high school. By university, it had become second nature to me. And I was always writing something. I do have to admit that I wrote some terrible poetry in that time. But I went on to get an engineering degree. I tucked my bad poetry away for a little while. But in between studying for physics exams or praying to God to help me digest whole calculus textbooks, I fell utterly and completely in love with poetry, with prose, with how people use language to shape the world. I fell in love with complex and flawed characters, stories that had color and texture. I poured myself into Sonia Sanchez, into Maya Angelou, into Toni Morrison, into Chinua Achebe, Chris Abani, Chimamanda Adichie. I felt like I had just discovered the secret society of magicians. These people who wrote from their own distinct personal experiences, who were honest and clear about who they were. They took language and bent it on its head, and they did not apologize for who they were. They were, in fact, celebrating all of the contradictions of their lives. So they took all of the darkness and the lights, the joy and the heartache, and they held it up for the whole world to see. Poetry and storytelling eventually became my whole life. And because of it, I was able to meet these people, some of them, and see very directly what it meant to live authentically. I wanted to be that way. Over the last couple of years, I've been living in Lagos, Nigeria, experiencing firsthand the complexities of that experience. At the time when I moved back, it was in the heights of the northeastern part of the country being attacked by this extremist group called Boko Haram. By now, everybody knows their name. Local and international news reveled in this narrative. Nigeria was rebranded from 419 experts to Boko Haramists. People were horrified and afraid, and I was worn thin by the senseless deaths, and so I wrote poetry, which is what I knew how to do best. I wrote, what do we do with all these bodies? How do we gather them up or know which arm goes where? Whose eyes are still searching? Whose head with the delicate head tie now sits on top of a suited body? Whose heart is this? To whose hollow chest does it belong? How do we separate the baby's legs from this river of forearms, of calves, of thighs? How do we return the boys back to their father? Who will rearrange the jigsaw of their faces, this mangled puzzle of teeth and flesh? What do we return to the mothers? Who will fish out her children's ears from this river of blood? Who will travel the whole length of it to bring back something whole enough to call by name? What do we do with all of these bodies? Then, on April 24th, 2014, 300 girls were kidnapped in the town of Chibok. And suddenly the whole world was watching, spellbound. The Bring Back Our Girls hashtag went viral. And for weeks, then months, the country had a new brand. A place where 300 girls go missing and nobody does anything. And so I wrote another poem. The history books won't remember it. How a group of girls the size of a small tribe vanished like a twisted kind of hide and seek. How we began our counting a little late. Imagine them giggling in their hiding places like the games we used to play when we were just little girls, when we were sure that somebody would always find us no matter how dark the nights, no matter how far we went. So if 200 is too high a number to count to, let's start at 1. The apple of her father's eye. 2. The one with her mother's smiling face. 3. The one who could have been a doctor. So what if we called them by name? What if we imagined our own daughters waiting, counting on the fact that we would turn the whole world over just to find them counting on our numbers? So if 200 is too high a number to stand with, why don't we start at 1, me, and 2, you? And while I was busy writing poems, the hashtag went cold. A whole year passed, and most of these girls are still nowhere to be found. So it is easy to feel hopeless and helpless, to be overcome by guilt, to allow that old shame to creep in when you look at the state of the continent. It is easy to feel like you don't have a place in the change that is required, that you don't deserve to be proudly African. But to be proudly African does not mean to deny Chibok, Baga, Garissa, Johannesburg, Durban. To be proudly African does not mean to deny HIV and AIDS. It doesn't mean to deny poverty or corruption. It means to hold these things up, to acknowledge them, interrogate them, without eliminating or smudging out what is whole, what is beautiful, what is incredible about the diverse continent that we come from, without denying how we have persevered, even in the face of the most crippling circumstances, how we are consistently reinventing and recreating what we as a people have contributed to all of humanity. Chinua Achebe once said, "My weapon is literature." And I feel the exact same way. The way in which I contribute is with my voice. But I'll take that one step further and say that my weapon is my life. Your weapon is your life. Each one of our lives is an opportunity to write a new story, to tell a new poem, to change the narrative. We are not all poets, but our singular experience may seem unremarkable, insignificant in the grand scheme of things. But if we exist, if we are unafraid to be proud, loud, and unapologetic about who we are, if we excel, if we are outstanding, if we stake out a place for ourselves in the world by championing our wildest dreams, we give someone else on a continent 6,000 miles away the permission to do the same. Because the only way that we really do change the world is by starting with ourselves. Thank you, guys.